Thank you very much for that rapturous round of applause. Hello, everybody. Hopefully you have turned up to the right room. This is indeed, holy smokes, how to vape yourself to root. If it's not the right room, there's plenty of other good stuff going on. So, first of all, a bit of a warning. I'm not going to set fire up to anything today, I hope. But there will be some profanity. So if you're easily upset by, naughty words, that kind of stuff, it might be a good time to go visit another track. Also, there is scenes of smoking, perhaps drug use. It depends how inspired you are by my memes. And crucially, hacking e-cigarettes will void your warranty. So if you come here looking for a nice, safe way to kind of get into smoking, this is probably not the talk for you. It's worth saying that some of the kind of the tools and techniques I'm going to show you, if you were to do that on a machine you do not own, that would be quite illegal. So don't do that. So by staying here, you're all agreeing you're going to do stupid things with me, right? Good, good. We've got the right crowd. I also have a lot of poor quality memes, and for that I do not apologize. So, who the hell am I? Well, this is my first computer, and I learned to program BASIC on it many, many years ago. So, my name's Ross Bevington, and I've been hacking stuff for a very, very long time. I had a misspent youth hacking computer games, and pretty much since then I've been messing around with computers. So for the last 10 years, I've been working in InfoSec. I work for BAE Systems. Some of them are here today. I apologize for the shouts from them earlier. Thank you, guys. And what I do is pretty much reverse engineering. And that might be Windows malware, it might be ARM binaries, or kind of weird exotic platforms. If you have a calculator ROM you want me to reverse engineer, or a NES ROM, I'm probably your man. I also hang about at DC44 Gloucester, so if you're in the West Country around there, you can turn up at some Monday a month. We haven't quite decided on what date it is. It changes rapidly, but yeah, I hang about there. You might have seen me hacking some cameras, so that's the CHDK logo, Canon PowerShot cameras. I've been hacking them for a while. You can add extra functionality to them. I'm also responsible for the Pentax Hacker Development Kit, hacking Pentax cameras. And I'm a member of Tool, so you may have seen me today picking some locks and stealing some wonderful rum and coke from MWR, which I'll be drinking through this presentation. So, today I'm going to be talking to you about hacking e-cigarettes. And first of all, what are these devices? I'm going to pick up the biggest and chunky one with like 2 batteries. There's no wonder why these things start fires on a plane. Like, it's got 2 lithium batteries in it with 500 milliamp hours. Like, crazy. These devices are pretty cool, not just for smoking, but also they're generally a system on a chip that has a GPIO that makes something hot. And what this presentation is a kind of a beginner's guide to getting into hacking these devices, because they're pretty cool. So hopefully you're all hearing actually the security of these devices, but why you should be interested in this? Well, it's bad USB, of course. If you've been to the Pikey talk earlier on, like bad USB is pretty much all the rage at the moment. Unless you've been living under a stone, you've probably heard about it. USB is a really great protocol, but its versatility is its downfall, because one USB device can pretty much turn into another USB device without any kind of limitation. So you might have a USB pen drive that can turn into a keyboard and start adding key presses, that kind of stuff, or a keyboard that turns into a mass storage device. So there are really good examples about how you can actually use this when you're doing things like physical penetration testing. So you walk up with your USB rubber ducky, which is this thing here, or your USB armory, and you connect it up and it will type in a load of commands and give you a root shell. Or you might wander up with your Pikey and steal the credentials from the machine. Or use your Arduino Pro Mini to launch a USB file system exploit, which will pwn the machine. Some of these attacks require the machine to be unlocked, but not all of them, because USB is hardware, and hardware is trusted. So why do we need another one of these platforms? There's already a ton already. Well, one glaring mistake which the author of these missed is that none of these can be smoked. So But there is another good reason, and it's secure facilities. So there could be an airport, it could be a data center. You might be involved in physical penetration testing, and when you go into engagements like that, you'll be stopped at the border, and your mobile phone might be taken off you. Your USB devices might be taken off you, but e-cigarette? Probably not. So when you're in your secure office, like Barack Obama is there, actually the kind of the policies in an office environments might help you take these e-cigarettes into the building, because this is like a crop from the health and safety kind of advisory something wiki page. And it says that pretty much employers will want to help their staff quit smoking. And to do that, e-cigarettes pretty much are exempt from all the standard smoking legislation. So this kind of goes hand in hand with actually trying to get into these kind of facilities that you might not otherwise be able to take kind of USB devices. So when you're going red teaming or physical pen testing, think about kind of these kind of things. So how do you actually go about turning an e-cigarette into something more interesting? Well, for me, it all started with a tweet. And this is Blasty from Einbase and CTF team. He's part of a really big German-Austrian CTF team, I can't remember. And what he posted was the code to deobfuscate or descramble the firmware of these devices. So usually if you go to the internet and get a firmware update, something like that, you can't just pop it into a reverse engineering tool or run strings on it. It's not that easy. You need to actually descramble that firmware. And this is the code that does it. And if you've got keen eyes, maybe difficult, you can see that none of this is actually that complicated. There's not really a lot of crypto. In fact, there's none at all. There's a XOR, there's some magic numbers, that kind of stuff. I can generally kind of crack this myself given time, but seeing that, I thought this seems like a really interesting thing to have a look at. So I went out and bought one of these for 40 quid. And they're incredibly cheap, like 30, 40 quid. That's quite a nice, interesting platform to work on. It's a low-powered device. It runs on a battery. You can keep it in your pocket for ages. So when I got my box, I looked on it. First of all, there's a printing error, and said they had upgradable fireware. And I don't know about you, but I'm a bit worried if someone says it's got upgradable fireware. I don't want to start any fires. I unboxed it, and this is kind of what it is. It's an atomizer. It's this thing at the top that gets hot. I'm less interested in that because of fires. It's got some buttons, and what those buttons are pretty much connected to what's called GPIO, General Purpose Input Output, and they cause things to happen inside the device. It's got a black and white OLED screen. That's pretty cool. And it's got a USB charging point. But the most important thing about this device is it can run Flappy Birds. So, and then while you're smoking, I don't know quite how it works, whether you've got it out here or smoking it like that, but you can play Flappy Birds, so you can waste that smoking break even quicker. You get access to Flappy Birds via a secret menu. You hold down 2 buttons and Flappy Birds appears. And this is going to be quite important for later, so remember Flappy Birds. So how do you fireware, or firmware even? Well, use the USB charging point. And you get the Windows binary, and you double-click on it, and it says plug in your USB cable, and you hit go, and it squirts the latest firmware over it. And this is really useful, because if it didn't have this functionality, if the USB port was hardwired to the battery, we wouldn't be able to do anything more, so it'd be pointless. So having that upgradable firmware means that the e-cigarette is somehow involved with putting firmware on its ROM chip. And this is really important. So we know what it is, and I think I know what we can do. So we're going to need a plan. So my plan is to make an exploit platform that you can smoke. So I want to create a really cool bad USB payload and put it onto this, and I wanted to do something with the keyboard, because that's really cool, and also something with perhaps some of the storage that's inside it. And I want to collect data from a machine and store it for later use. I don't want to start creating IP connections, because in some environments, if you start creating an IP connection, someone in a SOC somewhere gets an email or something. So I want to be able to plug this in and take it away. I also want it to work as an e-cigarette as well, and I want to weld the payload that I'm going to create, this bad USB payload, onto the original firmware to make it all work. And I'm going to try and activate this from the Flappy Birds menu. But the problem is I don't have the source code. Because if I had the source code, this would be relatively easy. So I'm going to have to do some reverse engineering. So this presentation is also about how I kind of approach these problems and how I kind of start off doing kind of the reverse engineering. So how are we going to do this? Well, we need to understand how the firmware works, because without that, we have no hope in actually putting any extra functionality into it. And to do that, we're going to have to do some reverse engineering. Now, the problem is reverse engineering is actually quite expensive to do, and it's quite hard. You can buy really, really expensive tools, and that makes the job slightly easier. But this is a job that is kind of quite hard. People are paid good money for it. So it's really important to have a process when you approach kind of reverse engineering anything. It doesn't matter whether it's e-cigarette, a router, whatever. And I'm going to kind of explain to the kind of the plan I use. And it's basically asking kind of 3 questions at a time, answering those questions on to the next one. It seems really simple, but even really experienced reverse engineers, that may be expensive as well, have kind of fallen into the trap of getting lost in the code. Because when you open up a foreign binary, it's really easy to get completely and utterly lost. That link there, if you can see it, I might put it on Twitter later. It's got some really good tutorials for reverse engineering embedded stuff. I'm not going to concentrate on teaching how to do that, because that's really hard, but kind of gloss over some of the easier stuff. The most important thing is to show you is some tooling, and tooling kind of varies in price dramatically. I'll probably show you the most expensive tool that I use, and it's Google. Google is, in all seriousness, the most important reverse engineering tool. How people did reverse engineering before Google, I do not know. When you're reverse engineering, you have to stare at this and keep Googling over and over and over again until the thought of looking at ARM or MIPS assembly basically gives you joy. So keep on Googling. And if you're not Googling, Google some more. One of the best plugins I've got for IdaPro, the really expensive reverse engineering tool, pretty much gets strings from binaries and Googles it for you. So that's quite an interesting plugin to get. But on to the actual tooling. Keep on talking about IdaPro, hopefully you know that. I'm not going to really dwell on that because it's quite expensive, but I've got a very expensive one that allows you to hit F5 and it turns it into source code. Let's say you're doing this on a shoestring budget, and there's no reason why you can't do firmware reverse engineering on basically no money. And pretty much the answer to that is a tool called Redare, which is open source. It is incredibly complicated. I look at it and it kind of blows my mind, and I'm an experienced reverse engineer. But I'm told if you become really, really good at Redare, you become awesome, mad skills. So if you are starting off on the journey of learning to be a reverse engineer and you have no money, Redare is probably the tool to have a look at. There's some other ones as well, Binary Ninja, you may have heard of that. The key thing that I want to show here is something called retargetable decompiler, which is an online decompiler. So it takes assembly and gives you something a bit like C. This is free. Uploading your code to it may be a bad idea, but if you're just starting out or you're doing some kind of open source work, it might be something to have a look at. So back to the plan, and on to my 3 questions. So is there enough space to actually put the code? Because this bad USB payload I'm going to write is going to be non-trivial, and it's going to have a size. And if it doesn't actually fit on that ROM chip, well, there's no point in continuing. So we need to know that first. How do we put code on device? And is there any public work? So I've already answered 2 of these already, so that'd be quite quick. And pretty much to answer these questions, we're going to Google a lot. We're going to Google for chips and manufacturers and SDKs, hitting the manufacturer's website and downloading all their tools. That's really important. And kind of Chinese forums as well have a whole kind of host of documents that probably shouldn't be kind of out there. With a device like an e-cigarette, you might actually have to start with a hammer. So this bloke here is obviously deep in reverse engineering thought. He's hitting his computer with a hammer and reverse engineering that or a screwdriver. You might need to take it apart and have a look at the chips on it. Google it. This is how the adventure starts. We're going to need to know things like what architecture it is and how much RAM and ROM has it got and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So I started Googling, and eventually I found what the chip was, and it was a New Micro M451 And if you Google enough, you get the spec document, and it's an ARM Cortex M4F running at 72 megahertz. It's got some RAM and it's got some ROM, and that's pretty much all I've got out of this. This makes kind of this device, or the smaller one I've got, basically a little slower than my first computer, which is pretty amazing. Oh, I'm going to have some rum and coke. Next up, do a bit more Googling. And I found this wonderful tool. This tool will eventually be my savior and my way of kind of cracking open the whole of the firmware. And what it is a third-party tool to basically change all of the strings that are in the binary in the firmware. So you can see on the left, there's things like easy, normal, hard. That's the kind of Flappy Bird stuff. There's some other stuff as well. And you can go through and change those letters to different things. Why you'd want to do that, I don't know, but there's a tool to do it. So yeah, this would crack it wide open for me. So thank you, Internet. So back to our questions. We'll answer them really quickly. Is there enough space? Well, based on how big the current firmware is, and I think we've got about 70K to play with. How do we put code on the device? Well, you program it over USB. It's a lot like programming in Arduino. The specifications out there, it's quite easy to do. Is there open source work? Yeah, we've got an SDK. There's this magic firmware tool. I was doing this about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. There wasn't much else, but now there's absolutely tons. So things move on. So we need 3 other questions, and now we're going to start actually getting into the reverse engineering. How does the software control USB? There must be a routine somewhere. We need to understand that because we're going to kind of co-opt that to do our own thing. Where is the Flappy Bird's code located? Well, we need to know that because we want to launch our code instead of Flappy Bird's. And how do you compile your own code? We need to know that for obvious reasons. These questions don't actually sound that hard, and because we're only going 3 questions at a time, that's good. But we'll still need to actually kind of use our reverse engineering tooling to actually get us some of these answers. So you've got this binary, you've descrambled it with a code from Twitter, and now you've loaded it into your reverse engineering tool. That might be IDA Pro, that might be Redare, it might be something else. And pretty much when you open it up, you'll be presented with something like this. And it's not that scary. I'm not going to explain to you how ARM assembly works or any kind of that stuff, but this is pretty easy to grasp. Basically, at the first 100 bytes of an ARM firmware, you'll have something called the interrupt table. And I like to think of this as a bit of a table of contents to actually how the firmware works. And if you get the manufacturer's spec and put it next to it, you can pretty much read it across from what one function does, because all of these are offsets to functions. And it'll tell you what it does. So ringed at the top, we've got the reset handler. This is the first function that's called, and it's called when there's an exception or something like that. And this is called to basically reset the device. And right the way down the bottom, we have got something called USB-D IRQ handler. And this is called every time the computer sends some data to the USB device. So that's really useful stuff. Now we understand kind of where we can start approaching these things. Next up, Flappy Birds. Well, we know we run Flappy Birds by pressing our 2 keys down, and we get our secret menu, and it gives us kind of an easy, normal, and hard. Now, if any of you are reverse engineers, you probably think, OK, I'll get the firmware and start searching for strings. So that's a really easy job. You run strings on it. None of those strings will appear, because what those are fonts or pictures. So how do we go from a font that's somewhere in the firmware to actually the code that is actually doing stuff with it? Well, the trick is this magic firmware tool. So if you click on Easy, right down there, it'll tell you the address of that data and where it's used. And if you search for that, your reverse engineering tool will pop up something like this. So here's some ARM assembly. Don't be too afraid. But basically, I've done the working out for you. D9 7E plus OXA equals that magic number. OK, this may sound really, really complicated. But BAE Systems has paid lots and lots of money to buy me a nice, expensive version of IDA Pro. And if I hit F5 on this, or if I upload it to a retargetable decompiler, it will turn it into this. And this is a lot less frightening. You can see that some functions are called, and they're called with some numbers, and then some if statements occur. And there's no real kind of shortcut to go from this to this, but after kind of reverse engineering long enough, you can see pretty much what happens is we're clearing the screen, we're printing some text to the screen, and then doing something probably to do with level difficulty, I don't know. The key thing to get through is you don't have to actually know everything about a binary. You only need to answer kind of the next questions. Almost certainly, you'll never fully understand what this binary is actually doing. So don't try to. This bit's important. Remember this bit for later. Flappy Birds. Flappy Birds, draw Flappy Bird menu. So let's answer our questions. So how does the software control USB? Well, there's a USB interrupt handler, and we know the address of it. Where is the Flappy code stored? Well, it's in sub 7234, also known as draw Flappy Bird menu. And how do you compile your own code? Well, at this point, we know that it's an ARM device, it's using the thumb instruction set, and good news is that GCC supports this. So we've got everything we need now to actually compile code. So we need 3 more questions. And we're getting to the end now. These are kind of the last 3. How can I get my code to be executed? And what should it do? And then does it work? The what should it do bit is really good because it's not actually a reverse engineering kind of question, it's an engineering question. And that means it's easy and tractable. So, on to the first question. Well, and that's going to involve looking into this reset handler. What happens when you plug this device in and it turns on for the first time? And usually these are quite complicated, but luckily we've got a really easy one. What it does is put some numbers in some addresses. I don't know what those are. I still don't know. Don't worry about it. It then calls system init, and then it calls main. Okay, this is pretty easy stuff. So if I can get it to call my main instead of the original main, it should boot up my firmware. So this should be pretty simple to make the device go. And we should just be able to call our reset handler from anywhere, providing the right numbers in the right places. So where do we call the reset handler? Well, we're back to draw Flappy Bird menu. So instead of doing all of this, instead we could do this. So we print the text on the screen, and then we just call our reset handler. And what's good about this is it should only require 4 bytes to be changed in the original firmware. Simple branch instruction. So that's really nice and neat. There's a lot of complicated stuff there, so I've drawn some pictures of what we're trying to do. So what we've got here, this is the ROM chip that's actually inside the e-cigarette. We don't really know how big it is. We've kind of guessed at its size. And we've got existing firmware, and we've got some unused space. We're going to compile our own custom bad USB payload and slap that on the end. If I did that and compiled it off and obfuscated it and put it on the device, it wouldn't actually do anything. It would still run the original firmware. So we need to run our code, and by doing that, first of all, in that interrupt table, we point it to our USB handler instead of the original USB handler. So that's 4 bytes of change right there. And then that's not enough. We want to kind of actually gain full execution over the device and reboot it into our firmware. So we need to change the Flappy Bird's code to call our reset handler. And then we'll jump into our firmware. The next question is what code to write. We've got 32 kilobytes of space. That's actually tons for an embedded device like this. Absolutely tons. So we don't want to write a really cool bad USB payload. We want to do something with keyboards, maybe mice, maybe a network card, like Pikey earlier. Definitely with storage. But I have no idea how to actually go about writing a keyboard and sending the stuff down and getting the RFCs and protocols and all that kind of stuff. And this could take a long time to be able to understand that. So I got lucky and I cheated. And I cheated by looking at the manufacturer's SDK. And this is why it pays to Google and Google some more, because in the manufacturer's SDK, there's loads of folders, and one of them is USB HID keyboard, one of them is HID mouse, and one of them is mass storage data flash. I had to do some work. For instance, the HID keyboard example just press the letter A continually, which is pretty useless to me. So I went to the Arduino source code and stole all that and co-opted it into my code base. The mass storage data flash stuff actually required you had a micro SD card connected to the GPI pins. So I changed that again to point to the firmware, the ROM chip that's actually inside the device. So I got all this code, compiled it with GCC, and it was about 37 kilobytes in size, so absolutely ginormous, which didn't sound right to me, so I read the manufacturer's docs some more, and they said if you could try the ARM-supported Keel environment. If you've done embedded programming before, you may have heard of that. And I recompiled it with that, and it was 7 kilobytes. So good work, GCC. You had one job. So back to the questions. How can I get the code to be executed? Well, it's simple. We call the reset handler in the Draw Flappy Birds menu. And pretty much it's that ARM assembler branch to that location. What should it do? You're going to do a cool bad USB payload based on the sample code from the manufacturer. Does it work? Oh, no idea. So months and months ago now, I compile this all up, put it on my device. I've checked it in IDA Pro, checked all the offsets are correct. I've obfuscated it with Blasty's code. I've used the firmware tool to upgrade it, and it's popped up, and it hasn't bricked the device. That's a really good first step. I hold down the Flappy Birds menu, and I've changed easy to be pwn because I'm a hacker, and that's cool. Next up, hit the go button, plug it into my machine, and a new USB storage device pops up. Great, this is looking good already. So I right-click, format it at FAT, great. Got 20 kilobytes of space, and not a lot, but a little bit. Okay, unplug it, plug it in again. Doesn't work. Yeah. So I fucked up. And it happens, and my process goes out the window, and I'm hastily reverse engineering, trying to understand why I've broken it. Is it like damaged forever? I actually bricked another device, proving to myself that it was my code, which actually saying back to it seems rather stupid. And that's why it pays to have a process. And eventually, after a lot of reverse engineering, I found out what was going wrong. So back to our diagram. We've got our existing firmware. We've chucked our new firmware at the end. And we've got 32 kilobytes for mass storage. Now, after this has been fat formatted, that's how it comes up as 20K. The problem is, this is all lies. This space wasn't unused. There's a blob for settings there, and those settings control what display driver to use, because when these things are manufactured in China, they might have 25 OLED screens, and the firmware needs to support each one of them. And when I erase that with part of a fat table, God knows what it's doing. It's probably crashing over and over and over again. So this is bad, because I've got this existing firmware, and that's my backup. I don't have any of this. So more soul-searching later, I managed to fix it, and it pays to download everything because the version 1 firmware somehow knows what is going on the device and recreates this settings blob for me. So I just randomly flashed all the firmware, and it fixed it, and phew. How I fixed this was I shrunk my storage space down and moved it after the settings, and then it all worked well. So, what does it all do? So, what I've created is a payload that acts as a keyboard, and it types in a load of PowerShell. And then it kind of does UAC elevation if UAC is installed. What this PowerShell does is pretty simple. It waits for 5 seconds, And then it goes through every disk on the machine and looks for a file called a.ps1. When it finds that, it executes it. Because in the meantime, while this has happened, I've switched to USB storage mode, and I've got now a USB stick that's appeared, and in it is my extra PowerShell. And what this PowerShell does is it dumps the NTLM v2 hashes, and it starts a reverse TCP shell, and you can do all manner of different things as well. And crucially, it's an exploit platform that you can smoke. So I'm going to try and do a live demo now. So pray to the demo gods. So hold on. So first of all, what I've got here is pretend this screen is in China, and it's my Netcat listener listening on localhost port 4444. So this is where the connectback shell is going to come into. And then this is my kind of victim machine. So you've strolled up to the machine, it's unlocked. And then hopefully the camera will work. Yeah. So what's going to happen, it's going to happen quite fast, is I'm going to try and put this behind here, and hopefully you'll see it, and you'll see the menu, and I'll hit the go button. Then a load of PowerShell is going to pop up in the bottom left-hand corner, and if you might be able to read that. And then I'm going to hit enter. The PowerShell is going to run. It's going to wait for 5 seconds. And then the USB stick is going to mount, and this all happens quite quickly, and then it'll get executed, and we'll get a shell, and we'll get creds, and it'll all be good. So this all precludes me not dislodging the USB cable, which happens all the time. So I hold down the 2 buttons, and you can't see that, but it does say pwn. I stay very still, and I've dislodged the USB cable. By law, this has to happen. Okay. Stay very, very still. Let's type in the PowerShell. And it's going to hit enter in a second. There we go. Now it's going to flick into being a USB device. USB storage device. There we go. It's popped up. I can disconnect this now. And what we've got here is our totes legit drive. And it should be exceptionally tiny, of 12 kilobytes of free space. So our PowerShells run, and our PowerShells actually a.ps1, and what a.ps1 does is say unzip a.zip into a temporary folder, and then execute the PowerShell scripts that are inside. And we got PowerShell scripts to, come on, get some hashes and invoke a shell. So first of all, if we have a look at some passwords. So here we go. These are NTLM hashes. So you can put this into your hash cracking stuff, and then off you go. And then hopefully, if we go into our Chinese environment over here, here we go. It looks like a shell's popped up. And if I type dir, it takes ages, but there we go. We've got a remote shell on the system. Done. Thank you very much. So we've just got a few more slides to go. First of all, everyone always comes out here and shows some attack, but doesn't tell you actually how to defend against it. Defending against actually these kind of attacks is really quite hard. A lot of it requires OS buy-in. So on Windows, you've got group policy. You can lock down things to specific devices. You're probably in an organization that hasn't done any of that. At least Microsoft is doing something to help you. These kind of attacks were very prevalent with kind of FireWire devices a few years ago, and what Microsoft has done now is if you have a FireWire device and your machine is locked, then the DMA drivers that give rise to all these things aren't loaded. And I think a similar thing has to happen with USB, because if you plug in if that was a network card, you can plug that into a locked machine and still do kind of amazing things. Auditing, who audits the number of USB devices? probably no one. Who audits or can get to search their organisation and find out machines that have ever had 2 keyboards simultaneously plugged into it? Probably no one, but that might be a good thing to write. One thing I found on my travels is Facebook's OS query tool. This is a kind of a host agent that runs on your machine, on your estate, and you can construct those queries and store them in a database and then ignore them. Realistically, without operating system buy-in, auditing is the only way you're going to kind of defend against these kind of things. So next up, I got my prequel meme in. Can you have this? Yeah, no. So at the moment, it's a license misery. It's got part of the 3.3 EVIC firmware, that's the manufacturer of the actual e-cigarette. It's got parts from the M451 SDK, which is a different license. It's got part of the Arduino SDK, which is a third license, and I don't understand licenses, I hate them, and I don't want anyone to sue me. That being said, time has moved on. And how I would rewrite this now is I would use an open source firmware for my model of e-cigarette called MyEVIC. And my plan is that next week I will take my code and I will put it into that repo. So if you've got one of the, I think it's 10 or 15 devices that supports, then you should be able to pull that and do this kind of stuff. So TLDR, you can hack USB devices. It's actually not that hard. If you've got a Raspberry Pi or something like that, it's really trivial. You don't need costly tools to do firmware reverse engineering, but what you do need is persistence. No matter how much your company is spending on reverse engineering tools, you need someone who's very, very persistent. MyEVIC, if you've got any of these devices, go visit that web page. It's got the source to do all these kind of things, and quite an interesting read. And it's possible to defend against these things, but it's actually quite hard. So there we are. Any questions?